Hi, this is Teresa Martin from Lower Cape TV, and welcome to this month's edition of Legislative Update. This month we're doing the Legislative Update in a couple of different parts due to some challenges of scheduling, which always seems to happen. So with me today is State Senator Julian Cyr. Welcome.
Hi, Teresa.
So good to see you
with
here.
You.
We're going to do something a little bit different because we have a chance to talk to each person separately. So we're going to talk about what's going on, and then we're also going to have a chance to hear from what some of the most deeply held potential projects are out there. The kinds of things that if we're looking back this time in December and all things have come to pass that you hoped, you can say, I was especially proud of blah. But first, let's get a quick update.
So this is a really particularly busy time in the legislature, hence why actually Sarah Peak and I aren't at the same place at the same time. So the House actually just took up their budget last week. So they finished that up right by the end of April. In the Senate, we'll take up our budget in mid-May, finish that by Memorial Day. We'll have a conference committee negotiation on those in June for something hopefully to be wrapped up in July. But we've been actually busy passing legislation. So there's a rhythm and a seasonality to what we do.
Right. We talk about the seasons of
the seasons of the legislature. And so typically we don't actually pass a lot of legislation in the beginning few months of a new session, right? You're filing bills, we're having committee assignments being made. But we've actually kind of gotten off to a quicker start this season. There's been some really important pieces of legislation that we felt that we needed to pass. And one of those actually is lift the cap on kids. This is a really arcane, unfair vestige of a sort of welfare reforms.
What's it about lift the cap?
It's called lift the cap on kids. So under current state law, or what was the former law, essentially we'd penalize individuals who, if they were receiving some sort of benefits from the state, social services, welfare, if they had a second kid, they wouldn't get any support or help for that kid. A pretty kind of, cruel policy. So actually in the Senate, we have taken this up numerous times, as has the House. We actually passed this in last year's budget. Governor Baker had vetoed it then. So we took it up actually early this session. The Senate passed the bill, the House passed the bill, the governor vetoed it, and we swiftly took action to override the governor's veto, and actually in a bipartisan vote, Democrats and Republicans saying, look, we need to be just treating people more fairly. This is going to mean that over 8,000 children in the Commonwealth are going to receive some benefits and services. So really proud about that. Another piece of legislation that had almost gotten across the finish line last session that we've come back to is a conversion therapy ban. So this is banning the practice of what's known as conversion therapy. Those are therapies or interventions forced on someone that's trying to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. So that actually was passed, signed into law. And then we also have been, thanks to the leadership of Senate President Karen Spilka, making sure that we're also passing additional legislation that's meaningful to the LGBTQ community. And one of those is around gender and gender IDs on state documents. And actually recently the Senate took up and passed what's called the Gender X bill, providing the opportunity for a third gender option on state IDs, on licenses.
What's the third option?
It's an X, so we call it a Gender X bill.
So I'm not A, I'm not B, I'm this
you're
other
not F,
category.
You're not F, you're not M. X is a third option. And so this is to encompass more and more people who are identifying on the gender spectrum, who are transgender, gender nonconforming. Actually, if you go talk to young people, go talk to adolescents, and in middle school and high school, their conceptions of gender and sexuality are radically different in an amazing way. I mean, they make me feel like a dinosaur, and I'm pretty young, and I've been doing LGBTQ work for years.
Well, just 2 years ago, during freshman orientation at college, this group of shell-shocked parents was asked, do they identify as he, she?
Preferred pronouns.
And we're also looking at each other like, what do you mean preferred pronouns? And many of us asked our kids afterwards, and they were like, well, of course you say your pronouns. Like,
the world is changing rapidly, but we've got to keep up on that. We've got to keep up with that from a policy perspective. And so, if you look at the state collects great data on a whole host of things called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. If you look at that survey, over 15% of youth in Massachusetts, high school students in Massachusetts that are surveyed identify as LGBTQ, which is an increase, right? So we need to make sure from a policy perspective that we're really keeping up with the times. Four other states actually allow.
That's what I was going to ask. Do other states, are we unusual in this?
So no, we're actually we're sort of in sort of the middle beginning of the pack. So 10 other states allow this on driver's licenses. 4 other states allow this on birth certificates, and we're actually looking to part of the bill we passed. And I worked very closely with my colleague Joe Comerford, who's a new state senator. She represents Amherst and Northampton and that part of the Commonwealth. Working with her, there's a new section in the bill actually that we passed that requires the administration to take a look at every single ID that we have out there, every single sort of gender marker on state forms, whether it's from Mass Health to veterans benefits to, you name it, taking a look at that and making sure that we're meeting people where they are.
Can I ask you kind of a silly question? Because I know there's a big push to change the way driver's licenses are done in Massachusetts so that they are considered identity for
the Real ID law.
Yeah,
Yep.
and how do those two things
So
interplay?
they don't conflict. Real ID actually is something that we've actually resolved. Massachusetts was one of the holdout states.
Yes, I know that.
Kind of going back and forth with the federal government on these criteria, and that's been
Right.
resolved. So this wouldn't impact that. And I think it's really I think shows the priorities of the Senate and the Senate under the Senate President Karen Spilka's leadership in making sure that some of the most vulnerable people in our Commonwealth, who tend to be, who, if you look at LGBTQ people, especially transgender and gender nonconforming and queer people, these are some of the most vulnerable people in our Commonwealth. And so we're really trying to step up in the Senate and make sure that they feel heard, they feel supported, and that again we're meeting them where they are. We're meeting what their needs are,
And they can identify themselves as who they feel they are, as opposed to
exactly
an externally imposed set of
precisely
identifiers.
So lift the cap, the conversion therapy bill, Gender X. This is a lot of activity for that seasonality piece, but I think it's really. I'm really encouraged by it. We also passed a supplemental budget that I think most relevant for your viewers. We did 2 things. One is heating support. The state provides resources for low-income folks with home heating challenges. We authorized $30 million. For that, we've actually had a little tussle with the governor who hasn't been wanting to release the whole amount of those dollars. I don't think he realizes. I don't think he's ever had the experience of keeping the heat low, worrying if you're going to be able to have enough heat.
You put
in the
gas in your
off-season.
car, you put heat in your house.
Exactly, but a lot of Cape Codders and people across the Commonwealth have to make that, particularly older adults. So we passed that, and we also made a number of tweaks to the short-term room occupancy law that was passed last December. We spent a lot of time talking about this. Mostly sort of technical pieces, but again, really trying to refine both the short-term room occupancy law and then also the Cape Cod and Islands Water Protection Fund, which is a real sort of landmark achievement.
Which is something we're going to come back and talk about in much more detail.
We are. It's going to be our first meeting sometime in May. So very excited about that.
So I'm looking forward to hearing more about that.
Yep. And then Senate budget's coming. So what are some of what I'm sort of focused on? Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station, the assessments that Pilgrim pays to the Commonwealth for emergency management, for environmental monitoring, for all the suite of services around the plant that help keep us safe, that requirement in law evaporates once they, quote, cease operations, which means once they're no longer generating electricity, which is going to be actually within a month, which is good news. But we need to make sure those assessments continue because we need environmental monitoring, we need emergency planning, we need those resources, certainly to be occurring during the decommissioning. From my perspective, as long as we have spent fuel in that fuel pool, we've got to do that. Spending a lot of time looking at how do you further harness harm reduction interventions in the opioid epidemic. We know that naloxone, commonly known as Narcan, has helped save lives. We need to make that more accessible, cheaper for police departments to buy, for nonprofits to get. So I'm going to focus there. And then I'm doing a lot of work around mental health and mental health access. We're going to have a big announcement in the Senate budget around a $500,000 campaign to kick off an effort talking about how do you personalize mental health, how do you unpack some of the stigma around mental health, that this is a brain disease that 1 in 5 Americans is struggling with at any given time. And so that's going to be a piece out of the budget, in addition to a whole myriad of other local priorities and other challenges.
So how is this budget season looking? Is it looking like we're going to all be more or less in agreement? Does it look like there's some big drag down battles? Are there big discrepancies in how we're seeing things?
So broadly, the economy in Massachusetts is doing well. Our revenues are strong. There was sort of some flurries of dips that kind of occurred midway through this fiscal year. That seemed to have evened out. There's always a tension between priorities. And we've got some really big needs. I've been spending a lot of time looking at nursing homes, or technically known as skilled nursing facilities. They are in a real fiscal crunch. The reimbursement that the state gives them, if you're a Mass Health or a Medicaid patient, is very low. And it's basically not enough to keep these nursing homes, keep the lights on. And so actually the House, to their credit, passed a pretty substantial infusion of resources into skilled nursing facilities. Hopefully we'll do the same in the Senate. So taking a look there, but it's a $42+ billion budget, and the budget's really a value statement about what we value, what's in there and what's not.
Well, that leads me to, we've got just a couple minutes left, and I want to zoom ahead. It's the end of the year. Let's look back. If everything you cared about moved forward, what are the 1 or 2 things that you would feel most proud about at the end of this year?
So just from a calendar perspective,
or
we don't really wrap up our work to the end. It's like, August 1st, 2020, right?
Okay,
what are we
we'll
looking
go
at?
to August 1st.
So I'll just speak of a few. And
the ones that, I know they're all so important, but the ones that most resonate.
Or some that I've been working on for a long time. So one of those is childhood lead poisoning prevention, which is an issue that I've been working on since 2011, when I first started off at the Department of Public Health as a legislative liaison. And really, the Commonwealth, and broadly as a society, we really haven't kept up our interventions on lead exposure in children. So, viewers may kind of recall in the 80s and 90s, there was a really significant push. We banned lead paint. We banned lead in paint, took a whole host of steps around interventions to make sure that we were keeping children, especially infants, 0 to 6 from lead exposure. So I've actually filed legislation I actually got passed in the Senate by the end of last session. We couldn't get the House to take it up. In this year's budget, I'm hoping that we're going to have a $2.7 million infusion of resources into the public health program that provides these interventions. Also looking for millions of dollars into the fund. It's called the Get the Lead Out Fund. It helps homeowners finance these initiatives and projects. So childhood lead poisoning is still a tremendous issue. We have over 2,000 kids in the Commonwealth who have had lead exposure who aren't getting services because of the lack of resources that we have. That in 2019 is unacceptable.
I think most people think, that was solved last decade.
No, because in Massachusetts, think about how old our housing stock is. The primary exposure risk for young children is lead paint in homes. Yes, from paint chips, but also lead dust in the home. Think of Cape Cod. I think of the house I grew up in. An 1850s Greek revival house. Is definitely there's lead paint in there.
No avoiding it.
And we know the deleterious effects of almost any lead exposure, particularly for an infant until they're about 6 or 7 years old. And so this is something from, I think we have a real obligation from a social justice perspective. If you look at who is disproportionately impacted, it's children who are in poor communities. It's children who are children of color. It's children from immigrant communities. So I'm really hoping we can make some progress on this and really kind of recommit ourselves to what used to be a really robust public health intervention, and something we haven't kept up on. So I'm working on that. And then another piece I spent a lot of time on is this concept of employee ownership. Employee ownership isn't a new idea. It's been something that's been going on for a while. There's actually a series of incentives that date back from the 1980s and the tax reform bill that President Reagan and Tip O'Neill had negotiated around providing incentives for individuals to sell their businesses to other employees. And so I've been working over the last 3 years to relaunch a state initiative, a pretty small initiative, but one that goes around the Commonwealth and helps explain, promote, help businesses navigate and figure out how they become employee owned. And so we actually earlier this last month kicked off a whole announcement. We had a big event at the State House featuring employee owned companies with the Senate President. And I'm really kind of eager to see that continue and keep up that work there.
I'd love to come back to that again as this continues to roll out too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real, I look at my own family's experience and how, think of your favorite iconic Cape businesses, right? Whether it's a clam shack or a restaurant or a store or a service provider. Businesses are really hard to start, especially here because the cost of property is just so high. And so how do we figure out creative ways to build wealth and to promote employee ownership? It's a bipartisan idea. I mentioned the President Reagan was a big fan of this. And I think, we've appropriated about $200,000 for this effort. I'm going to try to keep that up again in this year's budget and really just provide an opportunity for building wealth in our communities.
That's pretty exciting. And believe it or not, we are out of time. But these are all things that I'm looking forward to hearing more about. And once again, this is Teresa Martin from Lower Cape TV, and with me today is State Senator Julian Cyr, and this is the May episode of Legislative Update. Thanks very much for being here.
Appreciate it.